Okay, so wow, April 2025. I mean, talk about a month that like really shook things up in the financial world, right?
Yeah, no kidding. The S&P 500 plunging almost 5%, and then the Dow Jones just shedding over 1,600 points in a single day. It was
Yeah, it was pretty
it
wild.
was a wild ride for sure.
So obviously the big thing everyone was talking about was those new tariffs that the Trump administration rolled out.
Right.
A kind of blanket 10% import tax.
Right.
And then they piled on even more tariffs, specifically targeting China, Japan, and the EU.
Yeah, and as pretty much everyone expected, China wasted no time hitting back with their own 34% tariff aimed right at U.S. goods.
Tit for tat, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And what's, I think, really interesting looking back is how fast and hard that reaction was.
Yeah.
It really kind of drives home how interconnected our global economy is and how much power these big policy decisions, particularly around trade, they can really have this almost immediate domino effect.
Absolutely. I think what was really striking for me looking back at kind of the lead up to all of this was how much it seemed like established facts and all the expert analysis out there. It was just kind of disregarded.
Yeah.
There were all these warnings being issued. Economic forecasts were painting this, pretty concerning picture of the potential downsides and the long-term consequences. And yet it felt like they just kind of barreled ahead anyway. Mm. And it seemed like it was driven more by, a very specific ideology and maybe even you could say a degree of political theater than by a truly well-informed, data-driven approach.
Yeah. Right.
Where there was real thorough consultation and consideration of all the different factors.
Yeah, you really hit on a key point there. I mean, it kind of raises this fundamental question for us, right? Like how should we be making these big impactful decisions, and what happens when those principles are seemingly ignored or just kind of pushed aside?
Exactly. And that really is a perfect segue into our deep dive today. Mm-hmm. We're going to be looking at this really insightful article by Victor Leung, and he goes right to the heart of how to become a more effective decision maker. Mm-hmm. And I want to be clear. This isn't just some kind of abstract business school theory.
Right.
This is really about a fundamental shift in how we think about ourselves, right, how we view our own self-perception, and really how we operate as leaders.
Yeah, I mean, if we kind of bring this back to that, huge market turmoil back in April of 25, Leung's article, I think, gives us a really solid framework for examining not just these massive political decisions, on a global scale, but really any decision that you make, in your professional life, in your personal life, anywhere where the choice you're making actually carries weight.
Exactly. So our mission today is pretty straightforward. We're going to pull out those really crucial principles from Leung's piece that you can actually apply to your own decision-making process. So think of it as, we're going to kind of build a toolkit for you for those critical moments, mm-hmm, both big and small, where making the right call really truly matters.
Sounds good. So where do we begin?
Well, a good place to start is with what Leung considers to be kind of the cornerstone of good decision making, and that's the importance of being grounded in facts.
Right.
He makes this really clear argument that sound decisions, they don't just kind of magically appear out of thin air, mm-hmm, right? They're firmly rooted in evidence and this real scientific approach to understand the situation at hand. Mm. So it's about actively valuing the evidence, diligently seeking the truth. Yeah. And this is a big one, I think, really being open to having your own assumptions challenged, even those deeply held beliefs that you've carried with you for a long time.
Yeah, and that can be really tough sometimes.
It's tough, but it's crucial, right?
Absolutely.
And it might sound kind of obvious in principle, but Leung brings in this really powerful historical example from 19th century medicine. Oh. And I think it really drives the point home. Can you tell us a bit about that example?
Yeah, so back then, there was this huge resistance among surgeons to the idea of washing their hands before operating on a patient.
Right, like something so basic.
I know, right? It seems so obvious now, but at the time it was a really radical idea, and we know now without a doubt that hand washing dramatically reduces infection rates after surgery. I mean, the data was just crystal clear, but so many surgeons back then, they just flat out rejected it.
And it wasn't because they weren't intelligent individuals. Mm-hmm. I mean, these were highly skilled professionals.
Exactly. It was something much deeper than that, and Leung really nails it when he says it basically boiled down to a lack of humility. Mm. The idea that something so simple like washing your hands could actually have such a profound impact on patient outcomes, or that their long-held surgical practices might actually be causing harm. It challenged their whole professional self-image.
Yeah, it's really hard to admit that you might be wrong, especially when you've been doing something a certain way for so long.
For sure. And so the key takeaway here for you, the listener, is, don't let your ego blind you to the facts. Even if you're, an expert in your field, whatever that field might be, cultivate that humility to accept that maybe your current understanding is incomplete or maybe even wrong.
It's like that famous quote, strong opinions loosely held.
Exactly.
And it really is a striking parallel to what we saw play out back in April 2025, right? Ignoring those expert warnings, clinging to a particular belief even when all the data is suggesting otherwise.
Yeah, it's a classic example of what can happen when we let ideology or political posturing trump sound judgment.
Absolutely. So Lin Young then kind of shifts gears a bit, and he makes this really compelling connection between effective decision-making and leadership. He emphasizes that a decision maker doesn't operate in a vacuum. There's this vital element of bringing others along, and inspiring buy-in from your team and making sure that the decision, once it's made, is actually implemented effectively.
Right, and he states it really directly that, decision-making and leadership, they're fundamentally intertwined.
And he really stresses that leadership isn't this, this innate quality that you either have or you don't. It's really about how you're perceived by other people.
Right.
It's about how you interact with those around you, how you inspire them, how you build trust. And as Leon says, point blank, a leader without followers isn't really a leader at all.
Right.
So to be seen as a leader, to actually have that influence, you need others to believe in your ability to lead.
Makes sense. And this kind of naturally leads into, I think, one of the most important points that Leon makes, where he really challenges that, that kind of deeply ingrained, almost romanticized image of what a leader is supposed to look like.
Ah, yes, the myth of the cowboy leader.
Exactly like the John Wayne archetype.
Right, exactly. And Leong actually references the work of psychologist Gary Klein, who's done some fascinating research on how people make decisions in real-world situations. And Klein points out that there's this very popular cultural ideal of the decisive, bold, and completely unwavering leader. The kind of person who just strides into a situation, sizes it up instantly, and then declares the course of action with absolute certainty, no questions asked.
Yeah, and it's a powerful image.
It's a powerful image for sure. But Luong is very clear about the potential dangers that are kind of baked into this model. While that image of strength and unwavering confidence might seem appealing at first glance, it can actually be really detrimental to the process of making sound decisions.
Right. I mean, it can lead to all sorts of problems.
Yeah, so let's really break down those dangers.
Yeah.
What are some of the main pitfalls of this cowboy leadership style that Loon identifies for us?
Well, I think one of the biggest issues is this tendency to over-rely on personal intuition and past experiences, often to the exclusion of actually seeking out new information or considering different perspectives. And there's often this real resistance to self-doubt. The idea of actually asking for input from others can be seen as a sign of weakness rather than a strength.
Which can very easily lead to the formation of echo chambers.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Right, where dissenting opinions are actively discouraged, groupthink starts to flourish, and ultimately decisions are being made without really rigorously testing the underlying assumptions.
Exactly. And if we connect these characteristics back to, that tariff example from 2025,
right,
you can kind of see how a leader who's really prioritizing their own gut feeling and kind of dismissing those expert warnings, they might end up making a decision that has these, really significant negative consequences down the line. Yeah.
And Lungen points out that this cowboy approach often leads to these very inconsistent and chaotic policies, the taking of unnecessary risks, and the development of these very fragile systems that just kind of crumble when they're faced with any unexpected challenge.
Right. They just weren't built to adapt.
Exactly. So if this cowboy archetype isn't the way forward, then what's the alternative? What does Leung propose as a more effective and modern approach to both decision-making and leadership?
Well, the modern approach, as Loon describes it, really puts a premium on openness and a willingness to embrace uncertainty. Effective leaders, they actively seek out and they value a wide range of viewpoints during that crucial deliberation phase. They understand that being open to changing your mind when you're presented with new evidence, it's not a sign of weakness. It's a hallmark of intellectual honesty and real wisdom.
And there's this this really delicate balance to strike, isn't there?
Yeah.
Between fostering that open discussion and encouraging diverse input, and then being able to shift into decisive action and full commitment once a decision has actually been made.
Right. You need both.
Absolutely. And Loon actually brings in a couple of really great examples to illustrate this point.
Yeah.
One of them is Eric Schmidt's principle of diverse perspectives and a deadline.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
Which really emphasizes the importance of robust debate.
Yeah.
And challenging each other's ideas, but doing it within a very clearly defined time frame.
Right. You can't just debate forever.
Exactly. Once that deadline hits and a decision is made, then everyone needs to get on board and move forward as a unified team.
Exactly. And he also mentions Amazon's disagree and commit philosophy.
Yeah.
Which is a very similar principle. You vigorously challenge the proposed course of action during the discussion phase, but once the decision is made, you commit fully to its execution, even if you might still have some reservations.
It's a really mature and disciplined approach.
It is, and I think it really demands that we kind of reevaluate how we even define leadership. Yep. It shifts the focus away from this image of the all-knowing, infallible individual and towards something that's much more collaborative and process-oriented.
It's about the system rather than the individual hero.
Exactly. And Loom advocates for this new model of leadership that's defined by the quality and the rigor of the decision-making process itself and the clarity of the underlying purpose, rather than just displays of bravado or,
right.
This kind of lone wolf mentality.
Right. He's not impressed by the swagger.
Not at all. And he actually points to examples of really successful CEOs who actively prioritize collaboration, who establish these really well-defined and robust decision-making frameworks within their organizations. They're not pretending to have all the answers themselves.
Right.
Instead, their focus is on building strong teams and implementing effective systems that can actually, collectively generate the best possible solutions.
So it's really about empowering others to contribute their knowledge and expertise.
It is. And while they ultimately take ownership of the final decision,
they recognize that true strength lies in the integrity of the process itself.
And speaking of different models of leadership, Loom brings in this really well-known concept from Jim Collins, the level 5 leader.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic.
So how does that concept kind of fit into this discussion for us?
Well, the level 5 leader, as Collins describes them, is someone who embodies this really powerful combination of deep personal humility and fierce professional resolve. They're incredibly driven and passionate about achieving significant results, but they're also deeply grounded, self-aware, and they're consistently prioritize the long-term success of the organization above their own personal ego or accolades.
It's a very different mindset.
It's a world apart from that cowboy archetype that we were talking about earlier.
Right. It's not about being the loudest voice in the room or taking all the credit.
Not at all. It's about empowering others and creating a culture of excellence. And to really drive this point home about this shift in thinking about leadership, Lewin uses this absolutely fantastic analogy from Homer's Odyssey.
Oh, yeah, the story of Odysseus and the Sirens.
Exactly. Can you tell us a little bit about that story for those who might not be familiar with it?
So the story goes that Odysseus and his crew were sailing past this island that was inhabited by these creatures called sirens.
Right.
And the sirens were known for their incredibly alluring and seductive singing. And their songs were so powerful that they would lure sailors to their deaths. They'd crash their ships on the rocks trying to get to the island.
So it was a very dangerous place to be.
Extremely dangerous. And Odysseus knew this. He was aware of the danger, but he also knew that his ship had to sail past the island, so he had to find a way to resist the sirens' deadly song.
So what did he do?
Well, he realized that his biggest vulnerability was his own potential to be swayed by temptation. He knew that he would be drawn to their beautiful music, so instead of just relying on willpower in that moment, he decided to take a more proactive approach.
Okay.
He told his crew to plug their ears with wax so they wouldn't be able to hear the siren song at all.
Right.
And then he had them tie him to the ship's mast.
Wow.
And he gave them very strict orders not to untie him no matter how much he begged or pleaded as they sailed past the island.
So he basically removed his own ability to act impulsively in that moment of extreme temptation.
Exactly. He knew that he couldn't trust himself to resist the siren song. So he created a system that would protect him from his own weakness.
That's brilliant. And it really highlights that true leadership isn't always about being the strongest or the most decisive person in every single situation.
Right.
Sometimes the most effective leadership involves having the foresight to create those robust systems and processes that will guide you and your team toward the best possible outcome, even when your own biases or impulses might lead you astray.
Exactly. And Liang uses this analogy to really drive home the point that, we're all human, we all have our weaknesses, and sometimes the best way to lead is to acknowledge those weaknesses and create systems that help us overcome them.
It's a really powerful image, and it leads Leon to this very important concluding point, this call for a different kind of leader in our world.
Yeah, he really emphasizes the need to move away from that outdated cowboy model of leadership and to instead cultivate what he calls architects.
Architects.
Yeah, leaders who are really committed to designing sound and ethical decision-making processes, who actively and genuinely seek out diverse perspectives and input from a variety of sources, who ground their decisions in truth and evidence, and who ultimately act with a blend of both courage and humility.
Leaders who are not afraid to say, I don't have all the answers right now, but by working together with a solid process, we will find the best path forward.
Exactly.
It's a much more collaborative and I think ultimately a much more effective vision of what true leadership looks like.
I agree. And as Lewing argues, if we really want to see better outcomes in any context, whether it's in our personal lives, within our organizations, or even on that complex global stage, like we saw with the tariffs in 2025, the most important first step we can take is often a process of self-improvement, particularly in how we approach decision-making and how we choose to exercise leadership.
So for you, our listener, the core message here is really about striving to make decisions with greater clarity, leading with genuine humility, and inspiring those around you with unwavering integrity. These aren't just, these lofty ideals. They're practical and actionable principles that can fundamentally transform the quality of the choices you make and your effectiveness as a leader.
And so this leaves us with a really important question for you to consider, reflecting on everything we've explored today. Liang's insights, the events of April 2025, what's one personal belief that you currently hold about decision-making or the nature of leadership that this deep dive might now prompt you to question or maybe even reconsider?
It's a great question.
Because it's often in that willingness to really critically examine our own assumptions that true personal growth and significantly better outcomes can ultimately be achieved.
Absolutely. Food for thought.
Food for thought.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.